Yes,
Yes,
Mr.
we
Neri, we
can.
can hear you. We can hear you. Please go
Can we
ahead.
start? Thank you. Next slide, please. Can we show the next slide? Okay. I was asked to the previous one. Okay. Unlike the previous global crisis, all the three shocks are present at the same time. Supply shock because people can't go to work, demand is collapsing, and the financial markets face bankruptcies. Next slide. Next, please. This is more complex to analyze, much more damaging in its effects, and more difficult to resolve. As the former Finance Secretary Purisima said, is a much, sorry, in unconventional times like these, conventional monetary and fiscal levers are painfully inadequate. Next slide, please. Next. Our basic advocacies ensure food supply and support basic consumption. We do not let our people go hungry. Empower our people and enterprises to cope with this crisis and strengthen their resilience and remove any obstacles to this resilience. We have to improve the national balance sheet through productivity and equity enhancing investments. And we will need paradigm shifts for a more pro-people and pro-nature economic development. If I may quote the IMF, next slide. Next slide, please. This recovery is to be sustainable, and if our world is to become more resilient, we must do everything in our power to promote a green recovery. The previous one, please. According to Philip Kotler, citizens need to re-examine our capitalist assumptions and emerge from this terrible period with a new and more equitable form of capitalism. McKinsey said that ameliorating poverty, diminishing inequality, and protecting the environment could figure prominently in global and national agendas. In other words, things will not be the same. We cannot do things as usual. Next, please. The role of government. The role of government, next slide. Next slide, please. Support household consumption through income transfers. Demobilize unemployed through productivity enhancing investments. Add new economic values to compensate for GDP losses. Regenerate the natural resources to sustain food security. And strengthen our people's capacity to cope with this crisis. Can we go to the next slide, please? Next. 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 It's covered already. Next, please. Next. In fisheries, I would just like to emphasize the need to replant mangroves and restore our coral reefs and do fish sanctuaries so our fish can prosper, our fish catch can prosper. To facilitate markets, we will need internet and e-commerce access for farmers and rural entrepreneurs, and school nutrition and LGU purchases as a steady market for farmers' produce. Next, please. The role of the private sector. The role of the private sector. Next slide. Large corporations can engage as small farmers to inclusive business, and corporate agriculture nucleus estate can be made with small farmer linkages, and we can have private malls feature processed agriculture from the provinces. A strong and vigorous agriculture will ensure our people's survival and serve as a platform for economic recovery. Next slide. Let us go to telecommunications. Can we go to the slide on telecommunications? Next, please. Telecommunications. This is important because telecommunications, can we go back to telecommunications, is key to our people's ability to survive this crisis. We suggest that Congress pass as soon as possible the Open Access Data Transmission Act so we can have more players in the broadband space and reduce the cost. Efficient telecommunications is key to our people's ability to cope with this crisis. And internet should be seen as a basic human right. Next, please. Government. Let's go to government. Government. Okay. As Cesar Purisima said, government should be an anchor of stability, and government must be clear and coherent. Next, please. Next slide. We will have to redesign government so it can better respond. Go back to government, please. Government. We may need to redesign government so it can better respond to the current and post-pandemic scenario. LGUs will have to play a key role to speedily respond to people's needs in a dynamic environment. Countryside LGUs can activate their extension programs in the DA, and we may have to mobilize the military personnel for reforestation and upland development. Next, please. Imports. Imports. We will have to reduce our dependence on rice imports by diversifying our food staple. We expect droughts to happen in Burma, Vietnam, and Thailand because China is damming up the rivers, the upstream rivers of the Mekong Delta and the other areas in Indochina. Next, please. Next. Next slide, please. Okay, this is important. We can infuse money to the rural areas to activate the economy there. We can pay the upland farmers to do terracing to prevent soil erosion, plant hedge crops, forage trees, and fruit trees. They can construct gabion dams and water catchment projects for upland development. We can also pay the fisher folks to plant, restore the coral reefs, and protect their fish sanctuaries and patrol their fishing grounds. Next slide. Next, please. A productive countryside will reduce rural migration to the cities, and urban poor can find livelihood in the countryside. Financing sources. We can target a 2 trillion financing for these measures. So an economic recovery bond to shore up the fiscal resources for income transfers. So an economic reconstruction bond for countryside development. And I've already enumerated the other usual sources for financing. Next, please. Foreign direct equity investments. Okay, we will need to remove the disincentives of foreign equity investments. We will have to lift the foreign ownership restrictions, amend the Public Services Act, reduce our labor rigidities, and possibly have labor-intensive zones exempt from minimum wages. And we will have to pass the apprenticeship law. And LGUs will have to cooperate instead of hinder foreign investments. We now go to financial resources for government from property rights. Next slide. We can expand our agricultural areas through upland development. It's about 15 million hectares we can develop and convert them to E&D once they are developed and planted as prescribed. We can also pass the Sustainable Forest Management Act and revise agrarian reform law to feed the rural land market for agribusiness and fast-track land titles for agricultural properties and farm-to-market roads to add to countryside property values. Higher property values in the countryside and the creation of these new property values can be a source of finance for the government. We now go to our paradigm shifts. Next slide. Okay. Pope Francis has said that unbridled consumerism is destroying our planet. So we need paradigm shifts in our mode of development, from unbridled consumerism to an environmentally nurturing economics, from private spending for private wealth or public spending for common entitlements, from shopping malls to public parks, from malnourished children to universal school feeding. Next. From denuded mountains to agroforests and water catchments, from flooded lowlands to preserved wetlands and clean rivers, from barren seas and bays to a thriving marine life. Next. From low-income urban services to upland and coastal projects, from military fighting the NPA, we can have the AFP immobilized for upland development. And we can have drug addicts plant forests and mangroves so they can be more useful. Next. Next slide, please. From urban jungle and polluted air to green buildings. Go back and we go back. From urban jungle and polluted air to green buildings and rooftop gardens and walkable roads. From congested Metro Manila, we can transfer the national capital to another area like the Lucena Pagbilao area. Baguio has become rather overdeveloped, and we may need to have a new development for uplands like Mount Irid and replant it with pine trees. Mount Irid is in the Rizal province, and if we can build a road there, we can be in Mount Irid in less than an hour. Next, please. I will just do my concluding statements by quoting my favorite authors. This pandemic could give rise to a new era of human development. Otherwise, economic and social development may fall for decades. That's from McKinsey. Succeeding generations will live in a profoundly altered world. Practicing radical economic compassion and addressing inequalities, not just in our post-recession recovery, but here and now. Social unrest and collapse await as the alternative. We go to the last slide, please. From McKinsey. A study by the Edelman Trust Barometer found that more than half of its respondents in 28 markets agreed that capitalism as it exists today does more harm than good in the world. Almost 3/4 said that CEOs should take the lead in change rather than waiting for government. Pressure on business to serve their communities will only build. Business must step up. And finally, imagination, leadership, and a dash of inspiration will be required to figure out the right policies for the 21st century. This is from the McKinsey article, 10 Lessons from History for the Next Normal. That ends my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Neri.